to trickle in. Okay, great. I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bullis, and I'm the Senior Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our newest virtual panel on the role of the IMF in social welfare in Tunisia, Egypt, and Lebanon. In late October, the IMF announced that it had reached staff-level agreements with the governments of Tunisia and Egypt months after the IMF reached a similar agreement with the government of Lebanon. While each of these countries face different geopolitical and social challenges, they share increasingly complex and vulnerable economic situations, all intensified by the repercussions of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has heightened the Middle East and North Africa region's vulnerability to energy and food crises. Across all three countries, ordinary people continue to pay a steep price for their government's severe economic and financial mismanagement. To address this, the IMF has promised to prioritize social welfare and other measures to protect citizens from bearing the brunt of these crises in its reform packages. Despite these commitments, the mechanics still leave much to be desired. The staff-level agreements are not sufficiently clear, and much of the attention remains centered on fiscal and financial adjustment away from society-wide policy prescriptions. So today, our speakers will unpack questions such as, what do we know so far about the IMF staff-level agreements in Tunisia, Lebanon, and Egypt? How will these programs affect social protections and welfare in these countries? And most importantly, how will these agreements impact ordinary people's lives? Before we begin, I want to remind our audience of a few things. As always, today's conversation is being recorded and will be shared widely after the panel. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag #TimeUpEvents. And of course, we invite our audience to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function at any time. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's wonderful moderator, Belle True. Belle is an international correspondent at The Independent and has covered events across the Middle East since 2011, reporting on uprisings and wars from South Sudan to Yemen, Iraq to Syria. She previously lived in Egypt for 7 years, has covered Tunisia extensively, and is now based in Lebanon. Belle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be moderating this panel today. So I'm going to start by just introducing our excellent panelists. So today we have Salma Hussein, who is an Egyptian researcher and journalist covering the Middle East with a focus on Egypt. And she's recently edited an FES report on the role of the IMF in social protections. We also have Hussein Shaitu, a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, which is TIMEP, focusing on governance and economic development in Lebanon. We have Ayman Bisalah, who's a non-resident fellow at TIMEP, focusing on governance and the rule of law in Tunisia. And we have Timothy Kaldas, who is a policy fellow at TIMEP, researching transitional politics in Egypt, regime survival strategies, and Egyptian political economy and foreign policy. So I'm going to start, we're going to have basically 2 rounds of questions for each of the panelists. And please do, of course, submit your own questions as well if you have any follow-up points you'd like to pose to the panelists. So I'm going to start with Selma. You recently edited an FES report which looks at the role of the IMF and systems of social safety nets in several countries in the MENA region. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings and what kind of effect the IMF seems to have had?
Well, a bad effect. But let me start from the beginning. So first of all, I would like to point a little bit at the fact that this is a new generation of IMF lending. All along the past decade, there has been a historic number of IMF programs in the region. 18 till 2021, and with at least 3 other comings in 2022, it's more than 20 loans and agreements all over on a lot of countries, on a very wide range of countries. Why would I say that this is a new generation of, or supposedly a new generation of IMF loans? Because actually it came after 2 very distinct global and regional incidents, huge incidents. First of all, the 2008 crisis. where the world was like confronted by a global recession, a huge hit to all economies, advanced and emerging and low incomes alike. And actually it for the first time, like the IMF and the World Bank are changing their doctrine. They are more and more getting away from the what we call the Washington consensus, the neoliberal, ultra neoliberal agenda, and moving toward policies and programs that put into consideration the who is bearing the brunt. Inequality is bad now, according to their literature, for growth, unlike before. Minimum wage is essential for the health of the economy and for boosting local demand, and so on and so forth. So all these revisions in their literature were like were more voiced with the 2011 spark of social protests in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and Morocco, and lately Sudan, Iraq, and a lot of other countries, what we call now at Arab Spring, with like a little bit of what do we call it? A little bit of bitterness, yeah, let's say. So yeah, so we had to actually look at what's changed in their programs. Is this new discourse and new literature? Does it reflect on these new programs or not? And how did it reflect on such programs? And actually, the report is basically tackling three case studies in a rather systematic and methodological consistency. Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco. And they all found that actually all the countries at the eve of the COVID were at a worse position than the starting point back in 2011, be it on fiscal consolidation. You know, very ironic, the IMF was preaching for fiscal consolidation even in Morocco and Jordan, where they had less than 4% fiscal deficit to GDP. So it's like the Maastricht dream, you know, of the EU benchmark. So yeah, and yet the IMF kept pushing these governments to go for further reducing the fiscal deficit. So so that was like a first alarm for me that something did not really change here, because we're talking about the IMF and World Bank are describing our countries and the MENA region as very low, as being characterized of very low public spending on social protection. So when you ask them not to spend more on social protection, and by social protection I mean helping the poor, better education, better health, but also helping everybody not to become poor. So helping all the people along their life cycle so they do not fall under poverty and vulnerability. So yeah, that was like the first thing. And I don't know if I can do I have still time? I can go further?
Okay. Yes, so, you do. You have a few more minutes.
Okay, actually the second thing that the IMF kept focusing on monetary policies rather than fiscal policies, and sometimes even at the expense of fiscal policy. You know, you remember I told you he wants less public deficit, but he doesn't mind at all that the public deficit increases if it increases because he prescribed something for the health of the banks and the wealthy, like for instance raising the interest rates. So, you know, the first thing they come and tell you, okay, you are in a vulnerable position, you need to devaluate your currency, like what's happening in Tunisia, in Lebanon, and now in Egypt. So that's the first thing they start with. And in order to control the inflation, or to keep it managed, they would say that the country should raise the interest rates. So yeah, if you understand a little bit about economics, this would suppress the demand, and hence had a certain effect on inflation. But on the other side, interest rates is what lenders pay when they lend the country. So if you raise the interest rate, this means they get more interest. So interest payment, the interest bill within the budget increases so much. So what
Just to warn you, sorry,
actually,
Summer, we have just to warn you, I have to but you've got about 30 seconds. I'm so sorry. But just
Okay.
just to warn you, yeah.
So there is a whole vicious circle of actually moving more public money towards interest payments and debt service, rather than help increasing, covering more and more social protection schemes and tools. So yeah, that's basically the main finding. And another one, maybe in a second question, I would maybe elaborate more. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We will definitely want you to elaborate on the findings in the second round of questions. Actually, I think that's pretty much sums up my second question to you, Selma. But thank you so much for that. I'm sorry to cut you off, but just I think we're going to move now to Tim. You know, that's a sort of overview that we've got from Selma's finding, but to focus in on Egypt. The IMF board is set to vote on Egypt's staff level agreement, SLA, tomorrow, I believe. And of course, this is not the first time that Egypt's turned to the IMF. In fact, it's the third time in 6 years. And if I'm right, Egypt is the second largest debtor by amount to the IMF in the world. So given that the country is turning to the IMF again so soon, it's just been a few years, what have been some of the problems with previous loans and economic governance over the past years in Egypt? And can we expect things to be different this time around based on what we know so far on the 2022 agreement?
Thanks, Val. Yeah, I mean, Egypt's been working with the IMF since 2016, as you said, and the unfortunate thing is that all of the goals that the IMF initially set out in 2016 have ultimately turned out to fail. Each of the individual targets have actually gotten worse since the IMF intervention in 2016. So their objectives were macroeconomic stability, increased labor force participation, especially for women, inclusive private sector-led growth, and they also were trying to increase foreign direct investment. And if we look at where Egypt stands now, labor force participation has been in steady decline, especially for women, actually. So women are particularly badly hit. And part of that is, again, the fiscal consolidation that someone was talking about, because women are disproportionately hired in the civil service and the public service. And if the government is trying to reduce its wage bill, they'll be disproportionately negatively affected, which is a very predictable outcome and one that the IMF should have anticipated. The private sector has been in contraction for 63 of the last 72 months. And last month, the private sector contraction accelerated. It's one of the worst months in the past decade for the private sector. And in terms of inclusiveness, poverty has risen. It was 27.8% when the program began. Today it's 29.7%, which is really a low estimate because that number came out really at the very beginning of the pandemic. So it doesn't factor in the increased poverty that came with that, as well as the poverty that came with this year's increase in prices and inflation and the devaluation of the pound, which has lost 36% of its value officially in the past year. And in reality, on the black market, it's trading at 50% less, or sorry, the dollar is selling for 50% more than what it's selling for in the banks. So I mean, the situation is quite bad. And as far as macroeconomic stability is concerned, as you said, this is the third time they're turning to the purported lender of last resort because of financial crises. So obviously they haven't achieved that. Of the $33 billion in hard currency reserves they have, 4 or 5 billion are actually theirs. The rest of it's coming from the Gulf deposits. This is a $400 billion economy with $4 or $5 billion cash in dollars. It's a serious problem. And so and all of these indicators, by the way, were negative in 2019, before the pandemic started, before the war in Ukraine it factors in, before all of these other things. Because what the IMF and the Egyptian government have sought to do is try to suggest that all of the failures and all of the poor performance is due to externalities. And that's not true. Externalities made it worse, no doubt, as it has for every country. But there were plenty of structural problems with the way that the economy was being managed and the reforms that were implemented in the manner they were implemented before that. And the failures are due to multiple issues. On one level, the IMF failed to take into account the governance context in Egypt. So they went for some very kind of classical economic indicators and very classical prescriptions on how to solve problems without taking into account that this is a new autocratic regime that's consolidating power. And one of the ways that they do that is by controlling the economy and growing the number of companies that are tied to the regime. And in doing so, as these companies grew, they became much more aggressive about their economic expansion. They have an enormous array of exclusions from taxes, from VAT, from customs, from the bureaucratic procedures around acquisition of state land. They don't have to deal with customs in the manner that normal private companies have to deal with. So they have all these advantages. And on top of that, they had access to a lot of capital as they were borrowing in a very aggressive way. And they would deploy that capital aggressively to basically eat up market share. So in the case of, for example, the cement industry, which was already oversaturated with capacity, we already had too many people in that industry with the capacity to produce cement. The military built $1 billion factory that totally submarined everybody's economic model for making money. And so a lot of private sector actors look at this landscape, and we don't see sufficient reform in terms of the regulatory environment, in terms of customs, in terms of access to credit. And so they look at that, and that's a major deterrent for investment. And then the other major deterrent is the failure of the IMF to adequately engage with social protection. So one of the major indicators, or one of the major causes of private sector contraction, according to the PMI surveys that have been conducted for the last several years, is weak domestic demand. And why is domestic demand weak? Because poverty has expanded significantly. The purchasing power of the Egyptian pound and the Egyptian household has declined significantly. And one of the things that made Egypt an attractive place to invest is the fact that we have a large market. But if that market doesn't have the capacity to buy because everyone's dealing with poverty and runaway inflation, that really undermines the appeal of investing in Egypt for a lot of actors. And so this, again, should have been a predictable outcome. Now, the IMF's prescription in this new era, I agree with Selma, the move away from the Washington consensus was supposed to mean more social protection, a more holistic understanding of the role of government in the economy, things like that. But one of the prescriptions that they've been fixated on is replacing subsidies with cash transfers, targeted cash transfers that go strictly to those in need. Now, in theory, that sounds good, right? Somebody with a Mercedes doesn't need subsidized fuel. It makes sense. However, you have to take into account state capacity, right? Half of Egypt's economy is easily informal, and many of the people working informally are the poor. The state doesn't have good data on everybody's income. They didn't have an infrastructure for delivering this cash assistance. They were building it in the Takaful and Karama programs. Also, the IMF never set a specific level of coverage that was needed, right? So today, best case scenario, best estimate, half of Egyptians living below the poverty line, the 29.7% one that we're already said is lower than the reality, half of them are getting cash assistance. So that means—
Sorry, Tim, to interrupt. So sorry to interrupt. I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up because I have got to move on. I'm so sorry, but yeah, please.
Sure. It means for the last several years, tens of millions of Egyptians near and below the poverty line have lived without any sort of support while they've dealt with extraordinary levels of inflation.
Thank you for that, Tim. And I'm sorry to cut you off as well, because honestly, these subjects are really important and obviously huge. And so, I mean, shifting from Egypt to Tunisia, to talk to Ayman. I mean, it looks like Tunisia's agreement with the IMF has hit a few road bumps. I mean, just this morning, Reuters was reporting that their IMF board meeting on the Tunisia loan has been postponed. It was supposed to be taking place on Monday, as far as I understand. And that is in order to give the Tunisian authorities more time to finalise the reform programme, which now won't be re-presented until January. So just to ask you there, what do we know about this agreement so far and how the deal has been handled?
Thank you, Bill. So until yesterday evening, the board's review of the program was supposed to take place on Monday, 2 days after the elections, and last night that changed, and today that statement by the officials was made to Reuters. So one thing that I have to start with is that these negotiations have been ongoing for a little over 2 years between announcing it, considering it, and then officially sending the letter to the IMF during Mashishi's government last April 21, until the official round of negotiations. And for a detailed breakdown of these negotiations, a report by the Tunisian Observatory for the Economy was recently published, actually breaks that down to exact dates. What is known is very little, and that's one of the main problems. I'll get back to that. But basically, from the announcements made both by the IMF and Tunisia, the program is based around what the government has declared or dubbed as a national reform plan, which they announced in June 22. That doesn't really include a lot of detail except general objectives that they want to reach, some reforms, and like really small number of numbers, particularly on the cost of subsidies and some other indicators, which I will get back to. The main set of measures, though, that is really important and will have the biggest effects, that main set is the reform, or the so-called reform or targeting of subsidies, which are now subsidized at the price, basically for basic food products, grain products, dairy, vegetable oil, etc. Reforming state-owned companies, cutting down on the public wage bill, and reforming the taxation. Now, at face value, these are all very good initiatives. The issue is that, again, it is about how you do them. The approach with which the government is addressing these set of issues is one that is fixated on the cost of these measures. So basically, they're looking at all of these policies from a revenue expenditures point of view, which excludes the effect on people. What is known that they will be targeting, as in Egypt's case, the subsidies to the households that require it. They have been spouting the number of 20% of Tunisia's rich are benefiting from the subsidies, but actually they're not revealing the percentage of those rich people, because, as we know, the most recent numbers on poverty that we have date to 2015 and 2016, plus a very low minimum wage, which stands at less than $200. There are already systems of cash transfer of social assistance, but they are very low in nature and they're not really effective. But are like some child support and some cash transfers for families who are in a precarious situation. We have between 40 to 50% of the economy in the informal sector, mostly in the service sector. So these people are completely out of the system. And the last point on this is that, as mentioned in the report that Salma has edited, basically the direct subsidies are more redistributive in nature than direct cash transfers. So what they're doing is basically they're cutting down on households' spending and purchasing power. On reforming state-owned companies in the same way, and I'm linking this to the general approach of the government, they have not really engaged in a dialogue with any actor whatsoever, be it the syndicates, the business owners associations, civil society. There has been a complete opacity and a complete isolation of any actor whatsoever in drafting these so-called reforms, because they are basically measures the government will adopt, but the reform insinuates a positive, progressive approach, but these are basically all austerity-based measures in nature. Finally, on the public wage bill, basically, there is the tendency to influence the cost of percentage of like GDP of the wage bill, which is relatively high, but still, like when you take into consideration that GDP in itself is low, so you can also look at it from another point of view. That's for one. Two, really like the business climate is not does not create really employment opportunities for one. Second, all of the wages are really low in nature, so it's not really about how much the wages cost. Finally, on the taxation, if I have some time on that, basically
you've got about a minute.
Yeah, so but I think I'm going to take a bit two more, but if you allow it. So on the taxation, they want to integrate the informal sector only to widen the tax net, but actually everyone has been demanding a more progressive taxation, which aims to be redistributive in nature, but the government seeks to raise some resources to finance the budget deficit without really investing in the public services from like health services, education, etc. The last thing I'll say about the deal is that, and this is what actually led to the delay that was announced yesterday, and this is a really important point. The staff level agreement was based on 3 commitments by the Tunisian government, none of which has been met. So basically, that the reform plan will be enacted and launched already with the complementary budget bill of 2022 and the budget bill of 23. The budget bill of 2023 has not been announced yet, has not been ratified yet. So that one was not obviously met. The second is for the government to mobilize bilateral agreements and gain resources to finance their budget, not only wait for the IMF deal, which was their approach, and they have been depending on it since the beginning of 23, and they have made even the 2022 budget bill was made on the hypothesis that the loan will be approved and we'll get a segment dispersed before the end of this year. The third and most important element is that there seems to be a lack of consensus within Tunisia's executive authority. So there is a conflict between Qais Said and his government on the approach, particularly to the welfare element, that is the subsidy reform and the austerity measures that will affect particularly the health and education sectors. There is also a hypothesis that might be in play that the US and other shareholders have also pushed, in addition to the technical conditions that were not met, as I was saying, shareholders have tried to push for a delay to try and seek to leverage the deal, depending on what will unfold politically speaking, especially given that we have elections this weekend. Today is the first day for Tunisians living abroad to vote, but that I can go into that in detail later on if there are questions.
Thank you very much for that. And yeah, absolutely. We've still got the second round of questions, and we can go more into that later on. And we're going to move now to Lebanon. I mean, where I am actually sitting right now, and apologies, but if the lights go off, it's because my generator's failed. And so that's just a kind of visual description of what's happened here. But I mean, Lebanon is facing basically what's been called one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. That has in turn sparked huge social, humanitarian and political crises that the country hasn't seen in decades, if not ever. With almost no other options over the past few years, several governments have been attempting to negotiate an agreement with the IMF. Despite a somewhat, well, I think many people were surprised that a staff level agreement was reached earlier this year, progress appears to have ground to a halt. So what I wanted to ask you, Hussein, was what are the barriers holding back the implementation of this deal in Lebanon? And what do we know about the IMF's prescriptions for constructive change here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Belle. So obviously the situation in Lebanon is extremely dire. It's really daunting. I mean, more than 80% of the population lives in multidimensional poverty, which is a very relevant indicator to our panel today, actually, because it takes into account health and education access, which are at the heart of social protection financing. The current crisis we're in has led to the devaluation and depreciation in our currency by more than 95%. So obviously, as you've mentioned, the IMF is looked at right now. It's perceived by both the people and the political class as a savior. But the reality is, I think the IMF, in its staff level agreement with Lebanon, which was passed 9 months ago in April 2022, just a month before the country's parliamentary election, makes a very big assumption about the Lebanese political system and even like the financial system, really. They make the assumption that this political system is conducive and is responsive to reforms. So they make this very substantive assumption, and they've listed their very crucial reforms in any case. So all of these reforms that are suggested by the IMF are reforms that should be anyways committed to by the government. However, there is no clear consensus in the realm of the political class and their financial and business partners to abide to any of these reforms. And I usually like to refer to this as a mechanism of ballooning the illusion of conducting reform. So the IMF, by providing this staff level agreement and approving it, as kind of continuing this lifetime of the political class of creating this false illusion that we are trying to conduct policies in favor of the people when they're not. For example, amongst the reforms recommended by the IMF are, a financial restructuring strategy, since the banks in Lebanon have completely collapsed. And people have lost their money because public funds were siphoned. A lot of this reform relies on a political and consensus within the political factions, but also in the banking sector to actually agree on a distribution formula for these losses. And so far, we have not seen any of this. There isn't even a law that kind of clarifies or dictates how people's money will be restored. So, and also on fiscal reform, so this is a major reform in any IMF deal relating to fiscal adjustment. One major issue that lies under this umbrella is, the budget, the Lebanese budget for 2022, which was passed just a few months ahead of the end of the year. The problem with the budget, which is the main document that dictates spending priorities in the country, is that it features a lot of regressive taxation. There is no clear roadmap on how financial sustainability, how funds will be circulated, and how effectively these will be spent. There is no clear agreement on which exchange rate we will be using. So officially, we have the exchange rate of 1,500, but in the black market rate today, it's 45,000 to the dollar. So right now, there are multiple exchange rates, which has been leading to distortions in markets. If I have a few more minutes, I could just speak about one of the main problems that I see in the deal, and that is this. It's very privatization heavy. Like there is at different instances in the deal. And I can talk a bit more about this in the second round, but from an economic financial perspective, the IMF has recommended to kind of reform state-owned enterprises. For example, the electricity company, the public electricity company, which is to a large extent privatized. However, we have living in Lebanon and knowing the political economy landscape, we know for a fact that there is a very heavy degree of collusion between the government and the private sector. The private sector has helped the political class to extract rents and funds off of people's backs. So when it comes to this reform, just to conclude, there is no clear legislation on how the governance of this company will look like. Will there be oversight? Will there be some kind of tracking of how the activities of this potential company? And also, I feel like the IMF has not been kind of following on the failed lessons of in the Lebanese context. So kind of in 2011, when it comes to this particular issue, there was an electricity regulatory authority that was supposed to kind of provide an oversight on this privatization aspect of public services. However, no clear law and no clear agreement was put in stone, and that's how it has been stalled ever since. So it's not really clear to me or to any reader really, how is the IMF perceiving a privatization policy to feed into economic growth and social stability in any form or shape, really. So I think these are my main comments. Obviously, there are a bit more that I would like to talk about as it intersects with the issues of social vulnerability and the social crisis.
Well, I mean, that's hopefully what we're going to now kind of go into in the second round, because I think we've kind of done quite a good overview of where each country is with their IMF agreement or not in different countries. But we'll go now, I think, more into specifics, particularly about social protection. So I'm going to go back to Selma, because I'd love to go into more of your findings in the report. So on this subject, the IMF has obviously historically demanded countries reduce the overall cost of subsidies and other blanket welfare programs in favor of moving towards targeted cash assistance for the most vulnerable members of their population. But obviously in this region, specifically, governments just haven't had the infrastructure in place when those transitions have been pushed through, meaning that often in reality, what we see on the ground is that they just can't help swathes of the poorest citizens, the most vulnerable people. My question to you, and you can also expand this with other findings in the report you think are relevant, but has the IMF and the World Bank begun to acknowledge this issue? And if so, what precautions can be taken to facilitate better synchronization?
Okay, I've been talking since I started about the indirect impact of IMF deals on social protection by shrinking actually the fiscal space that is allowed to be spent on social protection straight out from the budget, and in return a lot of money goes to paying back external and internal debts, which makes people, the rich, richer. So because the richer you are, you can lend money to the government, basically. So that's it. The direct effects was actually what some of the very important it's just the similarity between Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, but also all other countries like Sudan and Egypt and Lebanon, is actually forced onto governments by the IMF in what they call prior actions. So in order to get a loan from the IMF, you basically need to implement these prior actions in order for the IMF to approve to lend you as a country. So the prior actions are the least transparent, because neither the governments nor the IMF are allowed to speak about them. So they don't put them on the table and negotiate publicly about them at this stage. So it's like one-sided, and it's very, very harsh. These are the very harsh conditions of the IMF, and the most aggressive, socially speaking, namely devaluation and raising the energy prices. So and when I talk about energy prices, there is this whole narrative composed by the IMF and the World Bank that they are very unhealthy for the environment, but also they are more beneficial to the rich than the poor. And they only take one indicator to prove the point, but when we look at the whole picture, when you raise the prices, they are not, the rich don't go on the streets, the poor goes to the streets. So there's something here that does not add up, So they are more impacted. And actually, that's what Tunisia's case study by brilliant researchers Shafiq and Jihan was pointing out, that the energy subsidies and also the food subsidies, and more importantly actually the food subsidies, are like universal systems. They are there for everybody to benefit from. But actually, the World Bank says that food subsidies are self-targeted, because if you're rich, you won't go for the ration cards or whatever system you get. So it's basically it helps the needy, not everybody. And same thing goes for energy, except for maybe the car fuel. The poor consume very little amounts of energy subsidies, yes, but the whole what I call the household consumers versus the producers, the big companies, if you go deeper, you will find that the companies and what at the IMF call the producers are the ones that are consuming most of the energy subsidies. But when the IMF talks about changing the prices, raising the prices, it does not tackle the producers sector, only the household. So we are here actually in front of a system that is camouflaged and that benefits the rich companies rather than the whole consumer society, the whole consumer households. So first thing is that energy subsidies are not that harmful. The bad targeting, if we are talking about bad targeting of energy subsidies, we should talk about producers and big companies, not about households, which the IMF don't. And last but not least, food subsidies are, yes, available for everybody, but they are actually benefiting the more needy. What the IMF suggests is that...
Just interrupt you there for a second. You've got maybe 30 seconds, if that's okay.
Okay. What the IMF made us all do is that scrapping the energy subsidies, which are universal, and only give cash assistance for the poorest of the poor. Well, all the studies in Latin America, in our countries, everywhere, they are proving how that cash transfer are not even, they are not reaching even half the poorest of the poor. So they are leaving out 50% of the targeted community, let alone the other part, the bigger part of the less poor and the vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sam. I mean, that's actually quite a devastating statistic that you ended on there. And so I was going to talk about the specifics of Egypt now with Tim. I know you've mentioned some of this already when you were talking at the beginning, but moving on from what Summer was talking and specifically looking at Egypt, I mean, and Egypt's an interesting example because we've obviously had the loan in 2016 and now we've got another loan. So you've got that kind of case study over the last few years. What's happened? Can you go a bit more into detail about what's happened with social protections in Egypt since the last loan in 2016 and what impact that's had on the population? You know, have there been adequate protections in place, given there were, you know, I remember those years, like the subsidy cuts just kept coming. And if not, do you have any hope this might be better handled with the new loan? Are there any other key tools that you think the IMF has failed to focus on? So if you want to sort of make that comparison, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, to echo the statistic that Sama just shared, like I said, at best, the cash transfers in Egypt cover 50% of the people living below the poverty line. And just for perspective on how many vulnerable people we're talking about, because like there's this idea that like, well, you know, the poor need the subsidies, but everybody else is, you know, just benefiting, and it's inappropriate. The World Bank in 2019, so in the better times or in the less bad times, estimated that 60% of Egyptians were living near or below the poverty line. So 60% of the population was vulnerable. All right, 60 million people. So if we take that as the body of people who required cash transfers, we're talking about a quarter of them maybe getting coverage, right? So there's a huge targeting problem. There's a huge capacity problem. There's a huge coverage problem. And if you look at the staff level agreement that the IMF and Egypt have put out, it says strengthen social protection in very vague terms, but there's no mention of comprehensive coverage, of a baseline of who needs coverage, of anything like that. And again, to echo Selma, what she said earlier about the government's role in also preventing people from entering poverty, the measures that have been taken and the extraordinary levels of inflation that have been inflicted on the population have brought a lot of people to that vulnerable position, right? There are a lot of middle-class families that fell out of that position in the last 6 years. And this affects, I mean, it obviously affects household income and things, but it affects like what food they can eat. Can they afford to buy vegetables on a regular basis? Never mind meats. You know, can they pay school fees? Because the Egyptian public education system is a disaster. And everybody tries to get their kids some modicum of private instruction if they can. And it's expensive and it's growing in cost. And when you eat away at a family's purchasing power, when you eat away at the value of their income, you're undermining their ability to do that, right? The state's not delivering education. The public is increasingly unable to make up for the state's failure to deliver education. And this has also got, you know, very worrying consequences for the future, because these are the people who will be entering the workforce, and their access to any sort of quality education is being diminished because of the increases in poverty, because of the depletion of purchasing power that we've seen over the last several years. And I think the worry is when we look at the loan that has been agreed to, I mean, the staff level agreement, like I said, is very vague. The main thing that they seem to be getting out of it is foreign exchange flexibility, which is, you know, means floating the pound, basically. The pound isn't really fully floating yet, so it's unclear to what extent that's going to happen. Egypt claimed it was floating the pound in 2016, and we know for a fact that it was controlling the pound for years. And despite the central bank repeatedly saying this, and I think also, I suspect that the IMF did try to rein in a bit the regime-owned enterprises in the economy, and the government wouldn't agree to it, which is part of the reason why this loan is so small. It's $3 billion over 46 months for a $400 billion economy that had a $40 billion financing gap for the coming year. It's a tiny loan. It doesn't do what Egypt normally wants these loans to do, which is instill confidence in investors. And that confidence didn't get delivered, right? So Fitch downgraded its outlook on Egypt. It means that it's anticipating that it will have to downgrade its credit rating. Egypt's ability to borrow is severely hindered, partly because it's already borrowed so much and spent that money so badly that it's currently spending between servicing debt and paying down debt more than the state has revenue. So the state is virtually insolvent. I mean, in terms of how much money it's spending over what it's taking in, and a lot of that money got wasted on mega projects and vanity projects and things that and also funneled through regime-owned enterprises who took their cut and charged the state extra so they could make money. So they leveraged the state to advantage themselves, while burdening the state and therefore the public. And so currently the appeal of lending to Egypt for the private sector is also you know, severely diminished. So I think the situation is quite worrying. I think the prospects of the coming year are quite dire. The pound has already been devalued significantly. It's very possible that it will have to continue to devalue if Egypt can't find sufficient financing as it tries to hold on to what dollars it has. It's got a lot of maturing debt that it's going to have to pay off in the coming year, and I think, and it's creating tensions in the regime. You can see it. You can see it in parliament. Suddenly, people criticizing the spending priorities of the government, which basically means the spending priorities of the president. They just don't say that. You see it on talk shows. You saw Mohammed Anwar Sadat tell President Sisi, "You've done a great job. You should not run for president again. You should, you know, retire at the end of your term." That sort of thing indicates that there are significant forces that are in disagreement about what to do. And I think that while some people in the regime seem to recognize that the way that they've been conducting themselves for the last several years is unsustainable, not enough have come to that conclusion, which is why we have this kind of continuation for now of the way they're doing business, and it's completely unsustainable. And then the worst thing about it is, so the modest GDP growth we've seen over the last several years since the IMF program began was built on debt-driven government stimulus, spending on infrastructure, spending on the mega projects, spending on the vanity projects. So the private sector was contracting, the public was increasingly impoverished. The vehicle for growth, to a large extent, was this stimulus spending. And if the state can't borrow, then that model for growth is about to collapse, because they won't be able to continue to push money into the economy, which is only going to further intensify Egypt's economic crisis. So the leaders of Egypt, I mean, they need to realize that this is completely unsustainable at this point. And I think increasingly their international backers are trying to push more pressure in that direction. It's been reported that the UAE and Saudi Arabia even pressured the IMF to get Egypt's military out of the economy. It's been reported that there's disagreements about foreign exchange policy. There's a lot of growing tension. And I think a lot of states are worrying about their ability to continue to bail out Egypt and the cost of doing so. And they have a lot of responsibility for this, don't misunderstand me. I mean, the French, the Germans, the Americans, a lot of people have made money on the way that the Egyptian state has misspent money. I mean, 40% of Germany's arms exports last year went to Egypt. Egypt spent between 2012 and 2021 almost as much money on French, put in as many orders for French arms as the entire European Union combined.
Wow. Tim, just to say, I'm just going to have to ask you to wrap that up very quickly, if that's okay. But that's nuts about buying of French weapons.
I just think that like a lot of other countries have also kind of happily played a role in profiting off of the spending that eventually led to the state being in economic distress. And they have a responsibility here too. It's not Egypt alone.
Thank you for that, Tim. Maybe in the questions afterwards we can go further into that. I'm gonna move now back to Lebanon. I mean, Tim was talking about, in Egypt, people living under the poverty line. Obviously, there's huge percentage of Lebanon also living under the poverty line, the extreme poverty line, and there's also different kinds of vulnerable, marginalized groups. So I wanted to ask you what the IMF deal meant for those vulnerable, marginalized members of society in Lebanon. And then you were talking about this in the first question, but I wanted to ask you if you wanted to expand on privatization policy, which obviously comes up repeatedly in the agreement, and what the social, economic, financial risks might be associated with this issue.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Belle. So I think when we're really focusing or zooming in on socially vulnerable groups in society, the first thing that comes to mind really is just looking, for example, at indicators like education and health, which are really at the heart of what we call in economics human capital. Accumulating human capital to make sure that people have a fair access, to economic contributions, etc. These in Lebanon, these two indicators are completely stunted, and it is definitely surprising that the IMF in its deal kind of sticks to just keeping it open when it comes to social safety nets or just social spending, leaving it up to authorities to really decide on where these priorities are really concentrated. When the numbers are really telling, more than 40% of youth in Lebanon have completely stopped their education, so they just stopped school. You have people, 60% of the population also would seek medicine or health services only if it's a complete emergency, which means that people have their own, their access to some sort of social stability or social safety net is extremely limited. And this is it's not addressed in the IMF staff level agreement. But more broadly, I think if we just zoom in on the deal itself, for example, the IMF rightfully asks the government to pass a capital control law, which is really to kind of try and stop the drainage and public funds people's money, really, because a lot of these small depositors are vulnerable people who have deposited a bit of their money just to kind of maintain a basic level of livelihood. These people have lost their money, and the complete ambiguity and defining what capital control is and in the context of Lebanon, it's just very ambiguous. The deal literally says past capital control. And what this yielded, it yielded a situation where lawmakers in Lebanon have engineered or designed a law, a draft law. We don't have a law yet, 3 years into the crisis, that basically does not acknowledge the right of the small depositors to access their money, but also around the onset of the financial crisis, that we had a capital flight of more than $5 billion that just left the country, leaving the banks in Lebanon, the banking sector, a zombie institution. So people can no longer access their money, and they can also no longer access loans for housing, and also companies, small to medium enterprises, can't access credit to kind of go by. So I think this is one channel. I feel that the ambiguity of the deal could be stunting, social safety, and also I think there are something I mentioned earlier. The taxation reform that is advertised or pinpointed in the deal is very weak. And per my reading, I think the IMF deal has very explicitly said that we should increase VAT taxes, which are often taxes paid by the most vulnerable in society. This is burdening the most poor in the country with a higher level of tax, adding to that inflation and the poor access to health and education I mentioned earlier. This is a whole disaster. And I also want to add that obviously as a recommendation, we need to start the conversation on a progressive taxation, on a wealth tax to protect the most vulnerable in society. And on the second half of your question on the privatization policy, I just want to say that the fact that the IMF has a very strong focus on privatization, whether we're looking at state-led enterprises, or just, for example, modernizing the public sector, which often means in very blunt terms, let's privatize the delivery of public services because public sector employees are not capable of doing that, many of which are vulnerable people as well. So what I would like to say on this is that first, it ensures that the ordinary citizen, going back to the aim of this panel, the ordinary citizen can no longer access the most decent, basic level of public services. But also, so it's limiting it to the ultra rich, really, or at least people who are well off in the country. And finally, I think this privatization policy is very gender blind in the sense that this heavy focus on providing privatizing companies because they are more efficient in delivering services. We are really looking at a situation where a lot of vulnerable women in the workforce, which are a very big percent per recent statistics, are no longer able to access the services, and this is further burdening them because a lot of these women do unpaid work. But also, we can even extend this to the queer and trans community in Lebanon, which a lot of which are employed in the service-based informal sectors, and who will also be limited by this policy. So, just to conclude, I think, so long as we don't have a clear understanding of the governance of whatever form of privatization will take place post-deal, whenever this is passed, I think the vulnerability we're witnessing right now would be doubled at least, because you're completely erasing a big social segment because of what Timothy said earlier. The typical understanding of an economy based on very basic indicators is really going to stunt the lives of these people and also economic growth more generally. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Hussein. And I'm going to just move now to Ayman. And you've got about 5-6 minutes, if that's okay, just for this question, because we've got lots of questions for all the panelists that have come in now from people watching. So, I wanted to narrow in a little bit. Obviously, I guess we were talking specifically about the most vulnerable, communities in Lebanon. Hussein was talking about members of the LGBT plus community. I wanted to narrow in again into a different segment of society in Tunisia, specifically Tunisia's powerful labour union, the UGTT, which has, of course, been a massive influential player on the Tunisian political scene. In September, the Tunisian government and the UGTT reached a deal on public sector wage increases, which was seen as both a necessary step to ease tensions, which are built over the IMF deal, but also as an actual prerequisite for a staff-level agreement, particularly amid fears that the IMF was trying to reduce government spending on wages. But from what I can tell, these tensions have actually flared over the last few weeks and months. I think there's concerns over the economic reform programme. As far as I'm aware, details of that are not known. And there's even been threats of further strikes. So what I wanted to ask you was, because this is very specific to Tunisia, what role has the UGTT played in shaping the course of negotiations and the content of the IMF agreements? And could their involvement actually, could this be something that actually halts this deal from being signed off at all?
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I might go a bit over the 6-minute mark. Before actually getting into that, I have like a couple of additions that feed into what my fellow panelists have said on the respective countries, because basically the same issues are happening, or the same policies are being enacted without really taking into consideration the context or learning from other experiences, particularly on what Tim mentioned with regard to cash transfer. So Indonesia, like they have been announcing that they will be targeting the subsidies through cash transfers, but they have not revealed how much that would be, what is the minimum wage to be eligible to benefit from those cash transfers. They don't take into account that it's not only those above, like below the poverty line that need the subsidies, because the thing is, the subsidy system is part of a wider trade-off in the Tunisian economy, is that like these subsidies cover the low wages, which the government in and of itself is marketing as a comparative advantage for Tunisia to attract foreign investment. So, and this is actually one of the talking points of civil society as well as the GTT, to which you pointed, is that if you want real prices, okay, give us real wages, and then we can discuss how to implement that, which is a pretty fair point. Now, to link to GTT, I think it's not just this negotiation, because this will be the 4th agreement with the IMF after 2011, and the IMF actually owns 20% of Tunisia's sovereign debt, which amounts to a little over the 1.9 billion of this loan, which will be over 4 years, which is basically also nothing. And the issue here is that past governments have been hiding behind the IMF to not really implement the measures recommended by the IMF or said reforms, which led to a lot of these programs being terminated and not going through with them. The reason is that that's not entirely true, because a lot of these governments did not want to bear the political cost of cutting down subsidies, of cutting down public spending, of public wages, of freezing employment, which they have actually, and which caused a lot of vacancies in critical services like the health services, public hospitals, or like in personnel, education, like the professors are really, they're not only like in personnel, but also the ones that are being hired through precarious contracts by the state. So it's all really leading to a decay of all things public. Now, pertaining to these negotiations in and of itself, the deal with the GTT on the wage increase recently was actually part of the prerequisites for the IMF deal. So it was good for the government in a sense that it allowed them to estimate the amount of public spending that they will be increasing, and they hope to put a freeze on any negotiation with the GTT based on that, so they would have calculations they can present to the IMF. Now, the issue is that those increases depend on the level of seniority and experience in the public sector are capped at 5% at the highest level, and that will take place over 3 years. Whereas November's year-to-year inflation rates were at 9.8. So basically, that increase is not really, does not even match the inflation. At the same time, the government has also passed, this government under President's government has passed a decree that limits ministries and public authorities to negotiate with GTT without prior approval from the head of government and from the Ministry of Finance. So basically, they're limiting the right to negotiate for syndical action, and this was been one of the major issues that GTT has had with this government, and throughout the internal negotiations that the government has been having, and parallel to the negotiation with the IMF, is that they have been trying to get the buying of GTT on so-called reforms, while GTT was trying to get them to pass what GTT is now calling wage adjustments to inflation. So they're also changing the discourse. They're not calling for increase, but wage adjustment, in addition to eliminating this decree. There has been an initial agreement according to GTT to remove this moratorium on negotiations, but the government, in reforming this decree, have basically kept it, but only altered the conditions. Now, GTT has declared basically war on the government in the last meeting earlier this month. They are refusing this subsidy reform. As I mentioned, they're basically, their line of action is, you want real prices, give us real salaries and real wages. They're also calling for an inclusive approach, and particularly them participating in the reform of the state-owned companies law, which has also been part of the delay of passing, delaying the IMF review process. And most importantly, now the GTT is using this to criticize the whole political process, and as mentioned, the lack of participatory approach and opacity, because even on the reasons that this review has been delayed, the government did not really talk to Tunisian media, but a source revealed the information to Reuters. And it's also a lingering issue since the beginning of the negotiations, because what we are gathering, basically, we're gathering from foreign sources, from the hints revealed by ministers on like the side discussions of some events, and two single instances, meeting with Tunisian media, an interview that the Ministry of Finance held last month, and a private meeting that the government held after the return from Washington with a group of journalists. But throughout all of these meetings, plus the recent bilateral meetings they held with professional associations, mainly the Order of Lawyers, so the Bar Association, the Labor Union, and some business associations, they only revealed some details pertaining to tax reforms that are relevant to these businesses. So clearly, there's a lot of.
I'm so sorry to intervene, Ayman, just because we have to wrap up. If you wouldn't mind, I'm so sorry. It's just because we've got.
Yeah. So basically, GTT, like to sum up, like the GTT is playing a balancing role with the government, utilizing the government's shortcomings basically in managing these negotiations, both within and without, to press for a stronger role in determining how these measures or these reforms will be enacted and in place, and trying to also gain political ground in spearheading the protests and the upcoming wave of dissidents basically in the country.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry to cut you off. Sorry to cut off everyone, because obviously it's fascinating and huge subjects. I'm going to move now to the questions from people who are watching us. I'm going to try and group them together if I can. I'm going to go, I think, to Lebanon first. These appear to be questions for you, Hussein. There's Joseph Jabeli, sorry, must use my Egyptian accent, and Stephen Howard. Apologies to the Lebanese. Talking about the staff level agreement in Lebanon. So they were asking basically Stephen was sort of asking, how do you assess Lebanese government's outreach and communications with the MPs and the MPs' responsiveness in cooperation with the Lebanese government? But attached to that, Joseph's question, which I guess is kind of related, how do you see the role of the Lebanese parliament in addressing any of these concerns that you've raised? And I know, sorry, it's quite a lot of multi-headed question, but I mean, this is a question I have for you as well. How is there any possibility of progress on these reforms or an actual conclusion of a deal in the absence of a president and a fully functioning government? And also, my thoughts to add to this, it seems that any implementation of any reforms is impossible. So how can this happen, basically, in this environment we have here in Lebanon?
Yeah, sure. So just on the issue of a communication between, the parliamentarians and a government, the caretaker government, I think it's important to point out that Lebanon has for decades survived, because of this cronyism they had. So the people in the government are handpicked to ensure that a confessional quota is met. So whatever we see in terms of communication is really a facade, because I think these two entities, alongside political factions in the country, are thought of as one entity. So clearly, obviously, the communication could be positive, but in terms of how efficient and how socially conscious these conversations are, I would say probably not. So that's on the first question. Given the current situation, so we don't have a president, we have a caretaker government. It's a problem because constitutionally speaking, a caretaker government can only intervene in very exceptional circumstances, which can often be extended to, let's say, emergency situations. So there is a serious threat to the security and stability of the country. The law does not explicitly state economic crisis per se, and this is why we need to rethink of the prerogatives of a caretaker government. But when it comes to international treaties or economic recovery plans or financial recovery plans, a caretaker government cannot really sign or approve such deals, because the logic behind this in the law is that you can't really limit a successive government by a foundational structural policy changes, right? So constitutionally, that is the current rule, let's call it. But if we know anything about the Lebanese political system and the parliamentary work, parliamentary functions, one can imagine there will probably be loopholes that will be fully exploited to ensure that there is a way around it. But there is a lot of ambiguity when it comes to how this could take shape. But in terms of how do we move forward, how can a deal actually be signed? But I think I want to kind of bring the conversation to what you asked me, Belle, on is it possible? Can any reforms really be attempted at this point, even if we did have a fully functioning government or a president? Would we end up with a situation where a productive conversation takes place? We would have all the reforms kind of picked, etc. I think it's really so it really boils down to the vested financial and political interests in the country. Or each and every reform very much is very much asking the political class and the financial class to really expose their corruption files, right? So when it comes to siphoning funds, when it comes to spending people's money on debt, on debt servicing, on inefficient subsidy schemes, on informal monetary interventions, etc. This all has to go out. The losses in the financial sector has to will be pulled out. So obviously, at the very heart of this conversation which is what I started with today, is the political class and the financial oligarchs really willing to open that door? Are they willing to respond to these reform proposals. In the current situation, it's unlikely, and we have, just to conclude, and I think we have seen this very clearly, we've reached, like, in terms of their inability to feel any sense of urgency, any sense of emergency. We've had our 10th parliamentary session today, and still we don't have any president voted into power. So, and this is the most basic requirement for a fully functioning state. So I would definitely worry about, financial and economic and technical reforms. So yeah, but that's it from. Any other questions or?
I think that's, I'm grouping them together. That's a sort of Lebanon question. So basically, I think everyone's got sort of 5 minutes left. I've got questions for each panelist coming off the back of the Q&A. So I'm going to shift to, I think Egypt is right now to Tim. Selma, I have questions on Egypt, but also slightly larger ones generally on the role of domestic think tanks and policy centers. It's related to your findings. I'll come to you later. So I'll go to Tim with the Egypt questions. There's a viewer called Helene. Some of her questions that she asked actually were already answered, I think. But I'm going to put together her questions and Edward Cousin's questions here into one for Tim. I think you briefly touched on this, but maybe you just want to expand on it. Will the plan be sufficient to restore confidence of foreign investors in the Egyptian economy? And linked to that, Edward Cousin's question is, he says it might be too much of a simple question, but is it a realistic scenario that Egypt will follow the path of Lebanon? And if yes, how would that look like? And if not, how will this be prevented? And that's actually a question I get asked all the time. So I'd be interested to see what you have to say about that. I mean, obviously Egypt and Lebanon have very different crises, but just, for the sake of this question, it would be really interesting to see what you have to say. And just to say, sorry, we have 5 minutes each. It's slightly shorter this time, just so we can be done in time.
Sure. No, I don't think that the current agreement with the IMF is sufficient to get Egypt out of its financial crisis. I don't think it's enough. It's not enough financing for what Egypt needs. The additional bilateral loans that were attached to it, the $5 billion, is also not sufficient, and it didn't, as I mentioned, instill enough confidence in market actors to give Egypt more access to other potential lenders. So I think Egypt's still in a pretty difficult situation, and I think they're going to have to do some really serious consideration of more significant structural reforms before they can have a serious chance at getting the type of financing they require. And in the meantime, I think the quality of life for the average Egyptian is going to continue to decline, and the cost of living will continue to rise, and it's worrying. I think with respect to Ed's question on the Lebanon scenario, I don't think it's going to get to that. I think it's unlikely for a variety of reasons. Egypt's economy, I mean, it's got a lot of problems, but it's a much more diversified economy. It has a number of sectors with extraordinary potential if it would just run not quite as shambolically and kleptocratically, but it has a decent amount of capacity. It does have a lot of revenue coming in. It just is used very badly. And the other thing that really is needs to be addressed, I mean, the IMF staff level agreement mentions it, but again, without any real detail, is revenue, right? Egypt's problem isn't cutting. I mean, it's cutting out the mega projects and perhaps the extraordinary amounts of arms purchases would be a good idea, but cutting services is really not the issue. Egypt's tax to GDP ratio is 14%. Morocco's is 28. Tunisia's is 31, 32. That's a huge problem. I mean, part of the reason why Egypt's struggling to pay off its debt, part of the reason why it has this financing gap is because it doesn't collect enough taxes. And part of the reason for that is I mean, first of all, there's a lot of evasion, but the other reason is that that a lot of the growth is happening in companies that are not taxable because they're controlled by the regime and they have exempted themselves for all forms of taxation and all forms of customs. And the IMF and Egypt have already kind of gone for the easy, low-hanging fruit of VAT and increased customs and these sorts of things that disproportionately affect the poor and working class, as Ayman pointed out. But what's left is to deal more seriously with progressive taxation and deal more seriously with capital gains, deal more seriously with corporate tax, and to deal more seriously with the official and legal evasion or avoidance, I guess is the term, that is taking place because of all these carve-outs for the regime. So that's, I mean, Egypt has the ability to get out of this. And one last point, and then because I know we're out of time. I was asked a lot over the last few years what the government is thinking in the way that they're spending their money and borrowing, because a lot of international actors recognized that this was unsustainable, and they were trying to understand what on earth they anticipated was going to happen. And what I said to them was that the government believes it's too big to fail. And I think that on some level it's true, right? 100 million people on the Mediterranean is a government that nobody wants to see fail for very good reasons. But what the government, I don't think, recognizes is that there's a lot of space between fail and get what you want in the way that they had been in the first several years, with cheap, easy to access money. Well, not even that cheap, but just easy to access financing. The world is different. Monetary tightening is one factor, and also they've taken on so much debt that their ability to borrow is constricted. And their backers and their lenders have the ability to impose a lot of pain before they get to fail. And I think that's what they're experiencing right now, is the beginning of that, where they're not able to borrow in the way they want. They're not getting the permissiveness that they were accustomed to. And it's going to be miserable for the population. I mean, that's what I worry about. But I don't think we're on the cusp of anything like Lebanon. I mean, thankfully for Egypt, I mean, what's happening in Lebanon is tragic. But there's plenty of pain that can still come before that.
Thanks for that, Tim. And yeah, we are running out of time. I think we've got about 3 minutes each for Selma and Ayman to answer these questions. So Selma, I'll come back to you, just because you've been looking at the overview of this. We have questions from an anonymous attendee who asked, basically, is it possible that a private sector-led regional effort can lead to more transparency across economies? Is there a possible private sector-led regional effort that can lead to more transparency across economies? And the second part of that question is, do you think domestic think tanks and policy centres have a role to play in the current environment, considering the lack of domestic advocacy targets and weakened institutions in MENA? If you can answer that. Sorry.
Well, in our countries, you know what I have been telling you about all the producers that eat up all the energy subsidies. These are the very well connected few businessmen, family-run businesses that have a lot of influence on decision making. Be it, but you know what we used to call Mubarak cronies, and those of they are still alive and kicking, and actually they like substituted the Mubarak's party by another ally, and they seem to get whatever. I don't know if you can see me or not. Yeah, okay. So and they manage to get to keep their benefits and even pressure for more. So I'm not sure, the private sector, you know, when we say about 14% of GDP in taxes, they evade taxes. They make sure that the law helps them evade legally their taxes. And then they afterwards also get their money channeled out of the country. I'm not sure how can these be tamed, and the IMF is not helping. The IMF program has a lot on. For instance, the government should put in or should make an antitrust law, for instance. And antitrust law is very important in our countries where monopolies are really all around the corners. So, but at the end of the day, the IMF put it as a non-binding condition. So the government says, okay, yes, I'll take the money, and then they don't do anything about it. So I see the IMF, for instance, pushes for privatization, for bigger role for the private sector, but a lot of problems are issuing from the lack of competition, the lack of regulations that would, I mean, anyone can get, for instance, tax exemption, but regardless, they abide by labor laws, labor rights, decent work criteria or not. So basically, the private sector is like creating more poor and not paying fair wages and giving them their rights. And on the other side, they are evading also paying taxes. And when the government invests in new infrastructure projects, they are the ones who benefit, because practically speaking, who is living in the new luxurious cities? This is the big businessmen who can afford it. So it's
I'm
like,
so sorry to interrupt you there, Summer. We've got 2 minutes left for Ayman's question, so I'm so sorry. Do you want to just quickly do one more sentence? It's fascinating what you're saying. I'm so sorry. Is that okay? Huge apologies. We've just got 2 minutes to very quickly squeeze in a question of Ayman on Tunisia from Ayub Menzli. Basically, I'm going to try and summarize the question. They're saying that the last attempt to reduce or eliminate subsidies in 1984 led to deadly riots in Tunisia, and President Bourguiba at the time had to reverse the decision. And so it's a constant reminder that such reforms are not just social, but also political and regime threatening. So the question from Ayub is, in the case of a no deal, what is the alternative for Tunisia? And that's obviously a huge question. You've got 1 minute to answer it in. Sorry, and I guess this is a problem for all the countries mentioned.
There's a lot to say about that, and then like what my fellow panelists said about the countries also applies to Tunisia, like almost to the letter. On the question, to be quite frank, that's what everyone is wondering at the moment, especially given the recent delay, which might also hinder the government's ability to get bilateral deals now that they were able to secure them anyway. It might also lead to downgrading by the rating agencies, further perpetuating the vicious cycle. And if the government is pushed to restructure the debt, that might also increase the crisis, which will definitely spill over and be felt by everyone. Like internal debt is around 35–36%. The banking sector is not investing, they're lending mostly to the government. That crisis will spill over to the insurance sector. So everything will follow, especially given the structure of our economy and like how it's dominated by some family-owned groups. That said, theoretically, this government is a godsend to the IMF because they have been struggling with managing to raise consensus on measures on reforms. The EGTT has always been against. So in theory, this should be the ideal scenario wherein the government, mostly old administration officials, technocrats, who would like to apply also those measures for what they consider lack of other alternatives. But even then, you'd have to accompany these measures with some economic boosting plan, etc. But we don't have enough time to go through that. The only issue is that Kais Saied himself is opposed to this government because he self-fashions himself as a man of the people and the guarantor of people's socioeconomic rights, which was among his also slogans to justify his power grab. So it is hard to tell, but definitely the few coming months, especially after the passing of the finance bill, will tell. And GTT is bound to clash with the government. We've already seen a lot of strikes going, others announced. And the crisis might come from others, from within. The state owes the state 9,000 million dinars. So there's like debts between state-owned companies and services, not to mention what the state owns to bread producers, subsidized bread producers. So it really is looking bad on numerous fronts. So let's hope for somehow a miracle and like to see how things unfold.
It looks like we're ending right on time. I just want to quickly thank Salma, Ayman, Tim, and Hussein for such an extremely timely conversation ahead of the IMF board's vote on Egypt. Egypt's agreement and a delayed but forthcoming, we think, vote on Tunisia's agreement in the new year. And thank you, Belle, for beautifully moderating this discussion. I just want to mention that today's conversation is part of a larger body of work by Time Up on the role of international financial institutions in the MENA region. So we certainly invite you to continue to follow Time Up's work on social welfare and the role of the IMF in Egypt, Tunisia, and Lebanon, as well as the work of each of our excellent panelists that you've heard speak here today. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us and contributing so much to the discussion. These are never the same without you and the insightful questions that you pose our speakers. You can follow Time Up on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to stay engaged with our work, and you can reach out with any media requests by email at press@timeup.org, and you'll find this recording on our website and YouTube channel. Finally, a huge thank you to the Time Up team and who made this event possible. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.